Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku manifested his quirk at 6 years old, and developed resistance to the flames, Deku x Momo, Part 1. So before we start, please go check out the author of this fanfic, Cinderelynx. Link is in the description. Also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the video. All men are not created equal. This was the most important lesson Izuku Midoriya had ever learned, at the harsh age of 6 years old. It had been 2 years since his closest friend had gotten his quirk, and he had been dreaming, wishing for a powerful quirk to match, to be able to stand up to Kaken. And where else could it lead to but here? Stop it, Kaken! Can't you see he's already crying? Katsuki Bakugu stared at the insect before him, who dared to stand in his way. Okay, so maybe he wasn't really an insect, not like the others were, but he was about as harmful as one. Deku was rapidly becoming a thorn in his side, but in the grand scheme of things, he would be little more than a thorn bush on the side of his path to the top. He had two options: laugh in the weaker boy's face, or comply. Now that he thought about it, he had only one option, and it was hilarious. Deku, you still haven't gotten your quirk yet, and you still think you can be a hero? Move. Let me show off my quirk. I won't let you. Katsuki narrowed his eyes. It was a little funny, but not enough to overwhelm the annoying part of it. Deku, I won't ask again. I'm not moving. Really, it was kind of sad. Deku had potential. He was really smart, and kind to a fault. What a waste of a heroic personality on someone with no quirk. That said, it wasn't unheard of for a quirk to manifest late. There might still be some hope for his friend. He'd have to stop getting in the way, though. Katsuki set his jaw. Fine then. I'll move you, he said, sending an explosive swipe at the boy, expecting him to be blown away so he could continue his bullying. Izuku was no fool, and he was definitely not a masochist. Kaken spent way too long winding up his punches before throwing them out. This made them easy to predict, but not that didn't mean they were easy to dodge. The blow singed the front of his shirt, as he stepped backwards, then jumped forward to shove the bully away. With his hands on his friend's shoulders, he pushed with all his might, and with a crash, his friend landed 5 feet away. Burn marks coated his shirt. Kaken yelled, more surprised than in pain. You got your quirk. Izuku felt a tingly sensation in his hands and forearms, and a building heat on them. He was on fire. It was his quirk though, so he quelled his momentary panic, and stared at it. Could he control it? Did it give him super strength? What did the fire consume? He had so many questions, and so little time. The fire was really heating up now, passing whatever threshold for heat he naturally had, and began to burn. Stop, drop, and roll. Stop, drop, and Izuku yelled, cut off by Kaken running up to him, and using his explosions to starve the fire of oxygen. Deku would be mildly burned, but if that fire didn't go out soon, it would be bad. You're still Deku. You might have your quirk, but what good is it if it hurts you? He growled, holding his friend's arms in his hand, and inspecting the damage. The skin was shiny, and inflamed, as one could expect from a burn wound. Thank you, Kaken. I'm fine, Izuku said, pulling his arms away insistently. The bullied boy had long since run off, leaving his friend and him alone at the park. Hey, Kaken smiled. You can make fire too. That puts you above Bendyfingers in my book. His quirk is kind of creepy. Izuku grinned tearily, the pain in his arms just barely bearable. His mom was going to have a fit when she saw the burns, but it would be worth it. He had a quirk. If he was right, it was just for now that his arms were burned. Like the rising hero endeavor, his quirk just burned him because he hadn't built up a resistance yet. Given enough time, he'd stop burning himself, right? Kaken cheered him up on the way home. Sure, the boy could be over the top, but he had a heart. The name Deku had never bothered him. It was more how Kaken had treated him when he thought he was quirkless. Now that he had a quirk, they were back on good terms, and that made everything okay in Izuku's books. His mom wasn't a fan, but Auntie Mitsuki insisted it was just boys being boys, banter between buddies. At any rate, it didn't hurt his feelings anymore, not with Kaken's playful teasing back in his life. Auntie Inko, Izuku got his quirk. Kaken yelled into the apartment, taking a moment to smell the air. Inko must have been baking something when they came in, because it smelled delicious. Katsuki? I haven't seen you in so long, his adoptive aunt called from the kitchen, taking a moment before coming out. Her little boy was still standing in the doorway behind his friend, a conflicted smile on his face. Izuku, what are you doing out there? I'm baking cookies. Tell me more about your quirk, sweetie. The boy stuttered, before Kaken grunted, and cut him off. His quirk burned him. He had fire on his arms, and he threw me like 50 feet, he said. Oh no! Izuku, sweetie, come here. How bad are the burns? She said, speed walking to meet him in the middle. She knelt down, and held his arms in her hands, turning them over to see the glossy burns underneath. They were pink, and looked painful. The boy's eyes widened, and they looked at each other. They healed, they said at the same time, laughing with joy. Are you sure? They still seem burned to me. Here, let me get the burn kit. We should have one in the kitchen. You know your father used to burn things all the time? Inko's voice faded, as she walked away. Sometimes it seemed like she talked to herself. But you're all pretty much planning to go into the hero course, right? The teacher said, tossing the papers haphazardly behind him. The class turned into barbarians almost instantly, abusing their quirks the moment they got excited. Someone's neck elongated in a nauseating manner. Another person pulled their eyeballs and whirled them around, and for some bizarre reason, a young man took off his shirt and screamed. Izuku was sure there were plenty of good uses for many of these quirks, but before he could think much more about it, Sensei, don't lump us all in the same group. Deku and I aren't gonna be stuck at the bottom with the rest of these rejects. Again, the class erupted in noise, and Izuku's face erupted, as well, quite literally, in fact. He felt a tickle at the back of his throat, and he sneezed a fireball into the air. The class quieted, and stared at him. Sorry, he stuttered, turning a vibrant shade of red. It contrasted nicely with his hair. Don't apologize, Deku. Remember, they're below us. Kaken, Izuku admonished, turning a further shade of red, as the class looked at him in hostility. If I remember correctly, the two of you are aiming for Yui High, aren't you? It was impressive how quickly the class changed tones. That's exactly why the rest of you should shut up. We aced the mock test. There's not a chance in the world for the rest of you. I'm gonna surpass All Might, and Deku can be number 2 or some shit like that. Right, Izuku rapidly nodded his head. The first lesson he had ever really learned was, Kaken was always right, and when he wasn't right, you kept your mouth shut. The bell rang not too long after, and Katsuki slung his bag over his arm. Deku, hurry it up. Izuku tossed the rest of his things into his bag, careful not to damage his journals. He had been starting his 13th this morning, adding an entry for the newest hero. Empty Lady certainly seemed strong, but he wasn't sure if he liked the heroine. She had certainly hammed it up earlier, and did damage that could have been avoided by letting Kamui finish the job. You know what, never mind. I've got some unfinished business. I'll meet you later, Katsuki said, walking out the door. Kaken! Wait up! Izuku yelled, but his friend was already gone. He trudged down the stairs alone, and made his way past the koi ponds, catching his reflection in one. Even these days, he doesn't seem to care much about me. It's like I'm just there to fill a role. If I just had a stronger quirk, maybe he'd think I'm worth something. He opened Hero Analysis for the future V13, and began to write. It was a clinical way of dealing with his perceived shortcomings, but it helped. My quirk seems to be getting more intense, but I don't seem to be developing more resistance. If anything, my skin just burns faster, and heals faster. I could maximize my damage by using it at the apex of a punch, and if I used it too much during a fight, my bones might deal slightly more damage than when there's skin over them. Testing how far down my quirk will burn would be painful, but valuable data, and could. He stopped writing the instant he heard something out of the ordinary. Growing up around Bakuga certainly left one with heightened senses, careful to avoid getting pranked in one way or another by the boy. Behind him, about 15 feet away, a gurgling noise came from the sewer grate. Wind rushed out of the pipe, followed by a green liquid with eyes. Scratch that. A villain made of green liquid. He had quite the imposing stature, 10 feet tall and broad, but was translucent. His intentions were even easier to see through. He was going to kill Izuku, and it was going to hurt the whole time he was dying. Scratch the war part. It was now more accurate, since he had slime down his throat, in his ears, violating his nose. It smelled terrible, and felt bizarre, like diving into a pool of muck. It pressed outwards on his sinuses, and filled his lungs in the most uncomfortable way. Struggle, as much as you want, kid, that'll make this faster. The sooner you suffocate, the easier this will be. Izuku gurgled a faint response, fully aware of its futility, and activated his quirk. Fire blasted out of the slime, hotter than ever, and the man roared. Excellent! You've got a great quirk too. You're my hero. Thank you so much. That's fair. I die here, and he gets my quirk. If I can't use my arms, maybe I can. He tried his best to think his way out of the sticky situation he found himself in. One of two things seemed to be happening. Either the villain was getting more opaque, or his vision was starting to go. That would be bad. The back of his throat itched, as the slime pressed against it, and he felt an urge to sneeze. Hey, that might work. Sneezing fire might have an actual use for once. He sneezed with all his might, and the villain did too. Really, this quirk was a double-edged sword. He could harness the powers of another, but they could harness his power too. In another universe, he might have been a great hero. Flames spewed from his face, and he fell from the liquid, drawing in lungfuls of air, and coughing up bits of slime. You little shit! The man roared, slamming a fist into the boy. Every joint in his body popped, as he was thrown down the path. He tensed, and twisted midair to land on his feet, thankful for the years of training with Kaken. Fighting a slime monster would be a breeze compared to a boy who could turn on a dime midair. At least, that's what Izuku would have done in his dreams. In reality, he screamed pathetically, and a huge man caught him midair, setting him down gently. Izuku began to hyperventilate when he realized who was in front of him. I'm sorry I got you caught up in my villain chasing, civilian. Everything is going to be okay. Why? Because I am here, Izuku stuttered inconsolably, as his idol performed his signature move just feet away. Texas Smash! He bellowed, sending forth a punch worthy of the gods. The boy had seen this move hundreds of times, perhaps more than any other All Might fanboy had. He had certainly seen it more than was healthy. The wind pressure generated shredded the liquid form of the villain, making him easy to clean up. Tashinori wasn't really sure where to begin with capturing a villain like this, but the eyes seemed like a good place to start. He felt a faint tugging at the bottom of his jeans, and looked down to see the terrified boy holding onto his pants. A fanboy, perhaps? My apologies once more. I normally don't let them get this far ahead of me. All Might, there are so many things I'd like to ask you. Autographs. He patted himself down before spotting his notebook sitting a few feet away. Okay. All Might smiled. Maybe one day, the hero worship he received would get old, but until then it fulfilled one of his oldest dreams. This boy reminded him of himself, in a way. He clearly looked up to heroes. Maybe one day, he'd be old, and retired, and see this young man unwell. He was getting ahead of himself. If he made it that far, he could worry about that. He had much more pressing concerns. I would love to talk, but I really don't have much time. Pros are always doing something, right? Especially at the top, it's important to keep moving. Wait, can everyone be a hero? If I hurt myself with my quirk, and he trailed off, sure that he knew the answer. With a quirk that harmed him, there was no way for him to be a hero, especially if it was only getting worse. Of course you can. Even Endeavor used to injure himself. Many of us All Might swore under his breath. I apologize, but I really must go. Steam began to curl off his body, and he prepared himself to jump. All Might. Wait. There's something above us, don't jump. All Might tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled cough. All Might? And before his eyes, his idol deflated. His body was gaunt, and his clothes hung off him like toilet paper on a tree. Worse than that was the look in his eyes, a mixture of panic and resignation. I'm sorry you have to see me like this. There's no way. You must be a fake. But I saw it with my own two eyes. How? Were you injured? Is that part of your quirk? Nobody really knows how your quirk works, so maybe. And off Izuku went, muttering under his breath at a rate a champion auctioneer would be hard-pressed to match. This kid, listen. It's like those bodybuilders who flex and posture. Come, let's get this villain to the police station. I'll tell you more along the way. Are you sure it's okay? What if someone sees you like this? Kid, would you recognize me like this? I'm about as far from All Might as you are from a piece of broccoli. Maybe further. Izuku pulled himself off the ground, and they began to walk, carrying the bottle of slime villain with them. Appetizing. As they walked, All Might told him his story. About 5 years ago, I took a hit I'll never recover from. My left lung and my entire stomach were destroyed. The surgery saved my life, but at a heavy cost. Right now, I can barely maintain my form 3 hours a day. It's been declining steadily ever since that fight. At this rate, I'll be retired or dead in the next 2 years. Dead? But you're the symbol of peace. What will the world do without you? That's why I'm looking for a successor. I've given up hope for a long life. Someone must take my power and be the next symbol of peace. What do you mean by taking your power? Izuku had keen ears. Maybe someone else would have missed that comment, or thought nothing of it, but not Izuku. All Might coughed, and wiped the blood off his hands. I meant nothing by it, I assure you. Are you sure? You don't seem sure. Absolutely. I'm not hiding anything. Why would I hide anything when you've already seen me like this? All Might began to stutter, clearly nervous. People have always questioned your quirk, and how you seem to come from nowhere. Izuku trailed off, leaving his question unsaid. He had a hunch, and his hunches were normally right. There are some things the world isn't ready, All Might said, looking at the boy. The moment he took his eyes off the path, a biker rushed past, and knocked the bottle from his grasp. The plastic bulged out, as the villain pushed with all his might, and the lid shot off like a rocket. He was free! Now, he just had to get away from this weirdo, and the kid. Maybe he could find another body to possess, and get the hell out of this town. Shit! Riku Watanabe had a problem. Several problems, if the bruising on his ribs was any indication. You're gonna have cash tomorrow, hear me? Katsuki growled, every other word punctuated by a kick to the boy's ribs. Maybe this was overkill, but he wasn't in a forgiving mood, not since a girl in the class below them had complained to him. Everyone knew that Katsuki was the top of the food chain in their grade. Even years before, he'd been at the top of the school. Nobody messed with Katsuki Bakugu. He hauled the boy to his feet, and pinned him to the bricks of the alley. Come on, Katsu. His sentence was cut short by a brutal punch. What happened to the bro code? Life happened. We haven't been friends for a long time, Riku. I don't like people who prey on the weak. What kind of hero does that? Riku did his best to look tough, but he was at his wit's end. What could he do versus an opponent like this? All he had was long fingers. Great for feeling someone up, not so great for fighting a guy who could blow you away with a single punch. You're not gonna get away with this, Bakuga. My dad works with the police department. This'll go on your record. Katsuki laughed at his nerves, and put his palm on the boy's forehead. Explosive sweat dripped off his hand. Sure. Run to daddy? I've got testimonials from that girl, and 2 of her friends. You won't get off easy either. If that's what it takes to get you to leave people alone, I'll do what has to be done. The boy's eyes widened, and he made a strangled gasping noise. Katsuki dropped him, and he stumbled towards the street on all fours. Something was wrong here, and it definitely made its presence known. A medium-sized invisibility coat, with a strong quirk? This works fine for me, the voice announced, thick and greasy like the aftermath of an American-style burger. Katsuki whirled around just in time to eat a punch to the face. Literally, the slimy appendage forced its way into his trachea, cutting off all the flow of oxygen to his system. 2 more tendrils yanked his arms towards the man, threatening to pull him into the slimy mass of his body. Katsuki screeched through the slime, his meaning clearer than his words. Get off me! Oh yeah? This is damn near perfect. Shouldn't even take 20 seconds before you're out like a light. Katsuki grimaced, the slime now covering his body. It was odd, like wearing a mask. His arms were completely immobilized, as were his head and legs, but he could move his fingers. Cupping his hands, he let loose a huge blast which forced the slime out of his mouth, and let him breathe a single lungful of air. Shit, I gotta get out of here. Maybe if I make enough noise, a pro might show up. He strained against the slime, the exertion, and warm fluid sending his sweat glands into overdrive. Explosions roared out of his palms, lighting garbage bags on fire, and hurling the villain into the light, barely clearing a pedestrian. Another explosion splattered slime across the sidewalk, but the villain kept his hold on the teen, barely giving him a chance to breathe. This would be so much easier if you just died, the villain yelled, struggling to contain the boy. Die! Katsuki screeched, releasing a huge explosion. He was faintly aware of the chaos he was causing, but he saw people pooling at the end of the street. If he could keep the villain distracted, they would be safe. Heroes began arriving on the scene. A watery rescue hero, and the super-strong Death Arms held back the crowd. The 2 heroes exchanged a look. Either had the right quirk for this job, especially when they were fighting a fire and keeping civilians safe. Besides, wasn't All Might in the city? Surely he'd show up sooner than later. All Might panted. Logically, he knew he was injured, but that didn't make it any less embarrassing to be beaten in a race by a scrawny 14-year-old. Izuku, and he had seen the smoke rising, and had come to the conclusion that their escaped villain was the one causing the mayhem. Izuku couldn't quite see over the crowd, but he was hesitant to leave All Might behind, especially in this state. He began, before the older man clapped a hand over his mouth, and pulled him away from the crowd. Don't say my name. Remember, nobody knows about this except you, and I. Nobody can know about this. Call me Tashinori. I suppose if you know my secret, I can't just keep calling you kid. My name's Midoriya. Izuku Midoriya. They returned to their place in the crowd, and he craned his neck to get a better view of the situation. It was hard to hear over the din of the crowd, but he could faintly make out explosions at the end of the street. Several things clicked into place at once. Someone nearby mentioned a hostage, a middle schooler who had been captured by the villain. He didn't know anyone else with an explosion as powerful as Kaken's. The most important detail was something few people would hear over the chaos. Kaken's trademark die, followed by a powerful explosion. His feet moved long before his brain realized what was going on, and Toshinori missed him by a hair. Young Midoriya, no! You'll get yourself killed! The crowd parted reflexively, seeing the kid barreling towards the situation. A few quick-minded individuals tried to grab him, but it was too late. He had hopped the barrier, and was running full speed into the smoke. The fire around him danced to his footfalls, and swirled in eddies towards him. Kaken! He screamed, activating his quirk to its fullest potential. Green fire roared out of his hands, as he made contact with the slimy mass, steam rising, as he reached through to his friend. Not you again! Back off! The villain swung his fist, sending an explosion into the air where that annoying kid had been standing a moment earlier. Where'd he go? Izuku didn't have time to be proud of the smooth slide between the legs of the villain, and grabbed at a patch of fire nearby. The fire on his arms swelled, and he punched upwards with everything he had, rewarded with a sickening slosh, as the villain's arm was sliced off. Kaken's arm poked through. He would have burns later, but more importantly, he had an opening. The boy grabbed his friend right, as a massive explosion blew the villain to one side, and Katsuki to the other. He was wrenched from the slimy mass, barely clearing it, as the man grabbed for him with his good arm, and landed harshly on Deku, tumbling to the ground. Deku, you idiot! Now we're both gonna die! Katsuki grabbed his friend, and ran, careful to avoid the slimy arm that was doing its best to turn them into pulp. It reared back, and came down faster than he could react. Both of the teens flinched, but no blow came. I must admit, I'm ashamed of myself. Everything will be alright now. Why? Because I am here. Toshinori smiled, outwardly maintaining his trademark personality. There would be hell to pay later. Overdoing his limit was never a good idea, but that's why he was searching for a successor. Perhaps he had found what he was looking for. Detroit Smash. The hero roared, punching forward, and grabbing the villain's eye. The sheer force blew his body away, leaving only the eyes and mouth. The entire street rumbled, and hurricane-force winds extinguished the remaining fires. A vortex of debris and heat roared into the air. All Might? Katsuki wasn't normally one to fanboys, but his bravado would have to wait. This was the real deal. Tiny droplets struck his face, and for a moment, he thought it was sweat. The implications sank in, as the sky darkened. All Might had changed the weather with just his right fist. The crowd was split between cheering and getting under cover, but not the journalists. Cameras began to flash, and somehow they weren't as bright as All Might's grin. They flooded into the area, as pro-heroes, and police gathered bits of slime, and began to interview the number one hero. Izuku and Katsuki were pulled aside by a policeman, to where Kamui Woods was waiting. Much to Katsuki's concern, Izuku didn't begin gushing over the pro, as one would expect of him. Instead, his friend was swaying a bit on his feet, leaning slightly against him. Deku? He asked, eyeing his friend. His arms were burned from the elbows down, but that was common with his quirk. His friend's face was bright red, and his eyes were unfocused. Where are the medics? We need to get him looked at, Katsuki growled at the pro, who was clearly distracted. Hey, I asked you a question? Kamui Woods was a proud man, but by no means was he an idiot. The disrespect in the boy's tone didn't sit well with him, but he had a point. We'll get the both of you checked out, but the medics are tending to a pedestrian who was caught in one of your explosions. It's going to be a minute or two before they can look at you. Patience is a virtue. Katsuki opened his mouth to insult the man's intelligence, but the words didn't make it out before his friend collapsed. When Izuku woke up, he was on an unfamiliar bed. This definitely wasn't his bed. No, the sheets were too scratchy, and the pillow too dense. His last memory was Katsuki slamming into him. Everything before that made sense, but he ought to remember something after that. After all, he was alive. He was alive, right? Something made a beeping noise to his right. Taking stock of the situation, he felt warmth to his left. Someone was definitely by the side of the bed, with their hand on his upper arm, where the bandaging ended. Bandaging? He thought to himself. Sure enough, a pressure wrapped its way down to his fingertips. If he had been captured by a villain, he wouldn't be this well taken care of. He opened his eyes slowly, and nearly regretted his decision, as his mom began to cry. Izuku! When I saw you on the news, and Katsuki, and All Might, and you were in the background, and you fell over and, Mom, I'm fine. What happened? Izuku asked, somewhat sure he already knew the answer. After Katsuki landed on him, he must have hit his head or something, and All Might must have been there to keep the villain off them. Inko Midoriya took a deep breath, trying to quell her tears. Beating the Midoriya waterworks was difficult, but she'd been managing it for 40 years. Okay, maybe Izuku made things more difficult than they had to be, but she was his mom, and she had a right to cry. Why couldn't he be one of the boring kids who never got into any sort of trouble? She sniffled. I heard an explosion, and you were already late getting home, so I turned on the news, and there was that awful villain, and when I saw him use that quirk I knew it was Katsuki. And then you showed up, and ran straight in, just like All Might would have. I couldn't watch it, but I couldn't not watch it, not with you in there, she said stuttering, as she held back the tears. And I couldn't see much through the smoke, but I could still see the fire, and then it all turned green, and an explosion happened, and you, and Katsuki came running out, and I saw him chasing you, and right when I thought he was going to get you, All Might showed up out of nowhere, and took the hit for you. All Might was there? Yes, All Might was there, I'm sure of it. Actually, I think he was here earlier, too. One of the nurses said someone wanted to talk to you when you woke up. How long have I been out? 2 hours or so. They were worried you wouldn't wake up until tomorrow, but they said it mostly depended on how exhausted you were, and how bad your concussion is. Izuku winced. He knew there had to be a good reason to end up in the hospital, but he had hoped it was just exhaustion, and the burns on his arms. Are they keeping me overnight? They'll check on your burns. But I think they were only going to keep you if you didn't wake up before sunset. I'll go tell them you're awake, Inko said, needing to step out to regain her composure anyway. Izuku sighed, as his mother closed the door behind her, looking at his bandages. With a quirk like this, he didn't stand a snowball's chance in hell of becoming a hero. Helping save Kaken felt amazing, fulfilling a dream he'd had for as long as he could remember, but he'd instantly been incapacitated. He couldn't even remember the aftermath. If all his efforts only landed him in the hospital, what point was there? His musings were cut short, as a woman walked into the room, followed by his mother. It was a routine examination, with one unusual detail. His burns were gone. Interesting. It's not out of the ordinary for someone to heal quirk-based damage faster than normal, but it's certainly useful. Your concussion seems to be healing quickly, too. Be careful with your head, and if you bump it again, we'll have to bring you back in for another examination. If you have any dizziness or nausea, come back in. You seem like a bright boy, don't do anything dumb, the nurse said, packing a vial of blood into a biocontainment unit. One could never be too cautious with samples these days, especially with quirks that weren't fully determined. The sun had long since set by the time the Midoriyas made it back to their home, and Izuku wanted nothing more than to take a month-long nap. Unfortunately for the boy, life had other plans. The moment he settled into bed, his phone vibrated on the nightstand. Blearily, he opened it. Perhaps it was Kaken texting him, or an automated message from the hospital, or Yagi Tashinori? How'd he get my number? Izuku thought to himself, swiping open the messaging app. Were it any other name, he would have dismissed it as a scam. His fanaticism for All Might was well known at his school, and he wouldn't put it past some of the meaner students to make a fake account. Midoriya, I'd like you to do me a favor. I have more to talk to you about, much more. Meet me at Dagoba Municipal Beach Park at 8 a.m. tomorrow, the text read. I don't know if my mom will let me. I'm recovering from a concussion, Izuku sent back. The situation was surreal to him. In just the span of a day, he had met his idol, saved his best friend, and now he was turning down a chance to talk about the #1 hero's secrets. Please? I must admit, it's nice to be able to tell someone new about these things, Tashinori responded seconds later. Clearly, he had no pressing matters to attend to. The boy had a brief, an absurd image in his head of the scrawny man in an oversized All Might onesie. He shuddered, and resolved to never think of that again. I can try to sneak out at 6, and pretend I was on a walk? I might need you to bail me out if she gets suspicious. Just pop by in hero form, and she'll be happy. Deal. I'll even bring breakfast. We can have a picnic. Izuku shook his head in disbelief. His idol, the most powerful hero to ever live, wanted to have a picnic on the beach at 6 in the morning. By the time the alarm he had set went off, Izuku had already gotten ready. Forgetting to turn it off had nearly been his downfall. Since his mom was a light sleeper, she came to see what he was doing awake so early. It was only a stroke of luck that awarded him the chance to leave. He had been in the process of making coffee when his mom had walked into the kitchen, and assumed he was making it for her. He would let her think he was being thoughtful. He felt a bit guilty for deceiving her, but he was sure she would understand if he were to tell her, which he could not because holy crap, he was going to discuss secrets with all might. While she had been concerned about him going on a walk at 6:15, he managed to make it out by promising her he'd have his phone on him the whole time. Silently he thanked whatever deity had granted him a strong constitution. Recovering from a concussion overnight was a superpower in and of itself. Crisp air breezed around him, as the bustle of his town started up, souring, as he neared the beach. Really, it was less a beach, and more of a trash dump, where currents washed forgotten things ashore, and dishonest people tossed their scraps. It was a shame, too, since the beach used to be a beautiful place to spend the morning. Young Midoriya, good morning! A stick-like figure called from below him, standing on a patch of dirty sand. I brought eggs, he smiled, and held up 2 lunch boxes like an excited schoolgirl. Izuku ran down the steps to greet the hero, and they made their way between heaps of trash towards a somewhat clean jetty. A small, roofed structure sat at the end of it, providing a good place to eat breakfast without worrying about sand and rubbish flying into the food. I'm here to learn the area because I've accepted a teaching position at Yui High. Izuku's eyes widened. You're going to be teaching at Yui? That's amazing, he said enthusiastically, setting down his utensils. I'm going to. Izuku's voice faltered, as he thought about his chances. I was going to apply there, but after what happened yesterday, I don't know if I should. What good is a hero who always gets injured? Toshinori's eyes lit up. That's one of the reasons I asked you to come here today, actually. If I recall correctly, you picked up on what I said about a successor yesterday. One of the reasons I decided to take this position, as a teacher, was to look for a successor, but I think I may have found one already. The man smiled at Izuku, at least until the boy asked who it was. He coughed away from the table, blood spraying into the wind. You, me. But I was just saying how I don't know if I should even apply. I only hurt myself yesterday, and Kaken, and I could have died if you didn't show up when you did. That's exactly my thinking, young man. You moved before anyone else did. You ran headfirst into danger to save a friend, and I've got the feeling you would do that for everyone if you had the right quirk for the situation. I can help you in that department. You want to teach me to use my quirk properly? Well, that too, I suppose. It's more than that. I've deemed you worthy of inheriting my power, the man said, standing up to let the wind ruffle his hair. He certainly had a flair for the dramatic. My quirk was passed on to me like a sacred torch, a crystallization of all those who came before me. If you would have it, I believe you have what it takes to be my successor. Izuku's jaw hung open. His thoughts were somehow both blank and moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, sort of like when a fan was moving too fast to see the individual blades so it looked transparent. Your quirk? You want to give me your quirk? Well, not as you are now. The power would make your limbs explode. No, what I'm suggesting is that I tutor you until the day comes that I feel your body can handle it. Either that, or I give it to you now, and we work our way up, maybe let your body get acclimated to it, as it grows. I didn't think this through very well, did I? Toshinori looked embarrassed. Teaching this boy would give him much needed practice. Not that he was going to say that to his new student. Wait a minute, can we go back to the part where you said you wanted to give me your quirk? Sure, nobody really knows much about your childhood, or little details like when it first manifested actually. Nobody knew anything about you before you debuted. In fact, I can't think of a day that goes by when I don't have a passing thought about it. I see it online all the time, but I don't understand what you mean by inheriting or passing on a quirk, and the boy droned on, and began to mutter under his breath. Midoriya, breathe. You're turning red. Oh yeah, breathing, that's important. And what about the limbs exploding part? That seems kind of important. How does this quirk of the inheriting process even work? I'll show you, on one condition. You agree to take the power and responsibility that comes with it. Really, though, Toshinori just wanted the boy to stop talking for a moment. Few people he knew of could mutter that fast, and even fewer were people he felt safe around. Principal Nizu of Yui, for example, talked under his breath a lot, and normally it felt like he was simultaneously planning your death and orchestrating the best way to make your day perfect. Why would you give something so amazing to Meph all people? I'm just a fanboy, Izuku said, doubt evident in his voice. Not this again. I told you, it's because you moved without thinking. In a way, you remind me of myself when I was younger. I remind you of you? Yes. Now do you accept the power or not? I don't really have a choice, do I? Of course you have a choice. It would be a lot easier if you said yes, though. Because you already know all about my injury, and because you already planned on applying to Yui, then yes, I'll accept your quirk. Alright, eat this. Toshinori reached into his hair, and pulled one out by the root. Your hair? You want me to eat your hair? Izuku cried, incredulous. When he imagined passing on a sacred torch, he didn't think it would be something as mundane and gross as a piece of hair, even Toshinori's admittedly amazing hair. All Might's bunny ear hairstyle was subject to nearly the same amount of conjecture as his quirk was, with some people going so far as to say they were the same thing. Trust me when I say this is the least gross way to do it. The only way to pass on a quirk is through transfer of DNA. You couldn't have, I dunno, baked a drop of your blood into some brownies? Toshinori stroked his chin for a moment, thinking. You're right, I suppose that would have worked. Either way, it's not my problem anymore. Keep that in mind for when you give one for all to someone else, a few decades from now. Izuku grimaced, and tentatively took the hair from the man. He twirled it around his finger, bundling it up into a tiny little ball, and swallowed it whole. Gross, definitely gross, but he really couldn't feel it after a minute or so. I don't feel any different. Of course you don't. How do you think your stomach works? Give it a day or two. Since you accepted, I have to file some paperwork with the school, and declared that I'll be mentoring you for the next 10 months. It helps to avoid conflict of interest claims from parents, and legal stuff like that. I won't bore you with the details, Toshinori said, beginning to back away from the table. I'll message you when you meet me again. We've got a lot of training to do, young man. But how will I know when Izuku called to the man, who was now about 20 feet away? Just text me. It's a lot of paperwork. The first thing Izuku noticed about One for All was its absence. By now, he thought it would have manifested in some dramatic way, but he hadn't seen anything obvious. When he thought about it, he had put on a lot of muscle and height in the past 8 months, but that was probably just hormones. Right. That, and weird dreams. Someone kept appearing in his head. A tall silhouette of a woman with 6 shimmering lights around her. One for All wasn't the only thing absent from his life. All Might know, Toshinori at this point was a harsh taskmaster. Every weekend was monopolized by the man. Every waking hour was spent doing something beneficial, and every sleeping hour was scheduled to the minute. He'd been unable to hang out with Kaken for a while, and it was beginning to frustrate his best friend. The only times he'd been able to sneak off for some time with his best friend, he'd had to spend most of the time sparring in preparation for the entrance examination at Yui. He missed Kaken, but he couldn't just take time off. The only way he'd ever be able to stand on even footing with his friend was hard work and months of dedication. Pride didn't come easily to him, but he was proud of how far he'd come since being given One for All. If not for Toshinori's training plan, he would have been sure he'd been pranked. Toshinori was an interesting person. A year ago, if someone had told Izuku that he'd be on a real name basis with the number 1 hero, he would have assumed they were mocking him. Now, though, he was reprimanded for calling the man by his hero name. No, Toshinori much preferred to go by his real name. He had precious few people he could trust to keep his secrets. It was surprisingly lonely at the top of the rankings. Izuku, Toshinori called, interrupting his quiet musings. I got your text. His mentor was standing on the sidewalk above the beach, smiling down at him. Toshinori's gaze swept over the spotless sand, seeing no sign of the trash that had been piled in heaps over decades here. Truly, his successor had impressed him. While his original plan had called for at least 10 months of hard work, Izuku had completed it in only 8, and in no small manner. Even at the height of his expectations, he didn't think the boy would clean the whole 1.5 mile stretch, and go back to sift through the sands for hidden bits of trash. No, Izuku didn't do things by half. Left to himself, the boy would surely have taken it upon himself to devise a method of cleaning the oceans too, but that would be left for another time. Young man, I'm impressed. I wish I had been here for more of the process, but pros are always busy, even when we're not fighting crime. That's okay, sir. Izuku grinned up at the man. He wished he had been here more often too, but he understood the pressure Toshinori was under. His grin faltered slightly, as a pensive look appeared in his eyes. Now what, though? The beach is clean, and I've still got 2 more months before the exam. Izuku shivered a bit. He hoped Toshinori wouldn't ask him to keep cleaning. As much as he was glad to be following in his footsteps, the only place left to clean would be the ocean. There were ways to avoid going in the water, but even going out on a boat in November sounded cold. Add to that the certainty of cleaning the ocean floor, and froze up just thinking about it. Battle training. I came to make sure you had completed your task, but I assure you I never doubted you. Battle training? Izuku asked, his heart beginning to pound. This was it. Finally, he'd be doing something more than moving trash. He was grateful for the few sparring lessons he'd had with Kaken. Any experience would help when it came to battle training, surely? Yes. I'm going to teach you how to fight. That's important for a hero. The man spit blood, as he raised his voice to reach the boy at the end of the beach. Come with me, Izuku. Let's find somewhere to sit and talk. I can't yell too much these days. Izuku scrambled over the sand deftly. In his opinion, a beach was a very good place to train your body. Running on soft sand was difficult, but it taught him how to balance properly, and after a few sore days he'd put in the effort to learn better running form. He'd even invested in some boots that wouldn't get sandy like his old trainers did. Battle training was an enticing idea, one which certainly justified being out of bed at this hour. 4 in the morning would seem ridiculous to many, but not to Izuku. Running on just a few hours of sleep was more than enough for him. The past 8 months had been difficult, but sleeplessness had never been a problem for Izuku, much to his mother's chagrin. Going back to his earliest days, he had been a light sleeper like his mom. As an infant, he'd woken up multiple times a night. His toddler years weren't much better. By the time he was old enough to remember, he'd lie awake at night, wondering about the world, and when he'd get his quirk. He'd never grown out of his introspection. Sleep was for people with time to burn, and Izuku knew too much about burning to do that. As he walked to the bus stop to make his way to Yui, he pondered on his quirk. How would it interact with One for All? He hadn't used either quirk in ages, spare a single time when he'd used it, as a candlelight in the middle of the night. Toshinori's quirk hadn't even manifested yet, which was concerning. What if he was fighting someone, and he accidentally punched them with all might level strength? The bus ride was uneventful, which didn't help his thoughts at all. Breaking down a villain fight he saw out of the window would have been a nice break from his concerns. He steadied his breath as he arrived outside Yui. The gates loomed over him for the first time, but the guest pass Toshinori had issued for him worked. Mentally, he was going back over every fight he had ever seen, every time he'd been beaten by Kaken, and the martial arts he'd seen in movies. At one point years ago, he'd been so desperate to dream of being a hero that he'd practiced a few moves and kicked a vase off the counter. His mother wasn't too happy about that one. Toshinori was waiting for him in the lobby. Izuku, how are you feeling today? The man's trademark grin was locked in place. Even in his shrunken form, he was an admirable sight. It quelled some of his nerves, but he still wasn't sure what to expect. Nervous. Izuku tried to laugh, but it caught in his throat, and his cheeks burned. His mentor laughed with him, easing the boy's awkwardness. There's nothing to be afraid of. Let's get going, he said, walking past Izuku and towards the doors. A cart waited for them outside. It looked a little bizarre at first, like Toshinori was going to go golfing, but it was much better than walking around the massive campus. So what exactly will we be doing today? You said battle training, but what does that entail? We're going to have you practice throwing a punch at a person. I think I know how to get One for All to activate, and I wouldn't trust anyone else with fighting you. There's always the chance you could blow them away by accident. That's one of the things I was worried about, actually. What if I punch you too hard? Toshinori laughed in an only slightly humiliating way. I might be injured, but that's why I've taken the day off. Even if you were as strong as me, it wouldn't hurt that bad. At worst, you might throw me off my feet. Don't sweat it. That took a lot of weight off Izuku's shoulders. Maybe it should have been obvious, but hearing it in words did a lot to alleviate the worry. Shortly thereafter, they arrived at a wide clearing. The ground had been worn down over years of use, and at some point had been cleaned up for more professional uses. It reminded Izuku vaguely of the setting of the Yi Sports Festival in years past, minus the stadium. Beside him, Toshinori grew in size. To Izuku, this was the difference between the man and the myth, his friend and mentor Toshinori versus his idol All Might. This is where we'll begin, he said and strode forth. Punch me, young man. He looked at his fist. With One for All? With all your might. One for All will come to you with time. Izuku stretched his arm for a moment, circling it around his shoulder, and walked to a position right in front of Toshinori. He reared back, and shot forth his fist with the entire weight of his body, twisting with the blow. Ouch! He yelled, holding his fist. You're made of steel! Toshinori boomed out a laugh. While his apprentice had a clear grasp of a good punch, it was a far cry from a One for All backed one. Try again. This time, visualize punching with more force than you could possibly generate, and then do your best to achieve that. Again, Izuku threw the strongest punch he could. Most people would at least have the air knocked out of them by the force, but Tashinori didn't budge an inch. What am I doing wrong? Nothing. Actually, your punching form is very good. If I were an average guy, that punch would have put me out of commission. I don't have many tips for using one for all. It came to me naturally. It came to you naturally? Izuku asked, unsurprised. It was difficult to imagine Tashinori struggling with anything practical. How does it feel to use it? Well, it's like an overflow of power. At a basic level, I'm stronger than the average person. Even without one for all, I could go toe-to-toe with a quirkless bodybuilder. He coughed, then continued. Or at least, I used to be able to. My point is that whenever I use one for all, I'm not punching with just my natural strength. I'm letting something else flow through me. Staring at his hands, Izuku tried to imagine what Tashinori was saying. The closest thing he had to one for all was the quirk he had been born with, but he didn't want to activate it for longer than a second, or he'd burn himself. Fire flickered into existence briefly, extinguishing itself just as soon. He took a deep breath and punched Tashinori once more. This time, he imagined the feeling of fire roaring through him, overflowing in his muscles and bones. Again, he was disappointed, as his fist slammed painfully into the man's chest. For a brief moment, Tashinori could swear he had seen sparks on Izuku's skin. It took more than 2 months before Izuku finally managed to use one for all. Twice a week, he'd been going to Yui to practice fighting with Tashinori, but simple punching wasn't enough to manifest the powerful quirk. They'd advanced past the basics with speed most people would be hard-pressed to match, moving on to actual fights in their 4th week. Izuku dove under a punch and ate dirt. Where's an opening? He asked himself, spitting dirt out of his mouth and rolling away from the much larger man. Even pulling his punches, All Might was an unbeatable opponent. As his mentor turned, he lifted his foot briefly, and Izuku darted forward. The action reminded him of what he'd done versus the slime villain that had captured Kaken, but this time, he spun on the tips of his toes and lashed out with a powerful kick to the back of Tashinori's knee. His opponent fell to a knee, but Izuku knew better than to revel in a successful hit. Keeping the momentum of his first blow, he switched the foot he was pivoting on, and attempted to slam the back of his foot into the side of Tashinori's face. Tashinori was much faster than Izuku. He had decades of experience fighting villains with much more power. He caught the kick with his hand, wrapped his fingers around Izuku's ankle, and threw him through the air, proud to see the boy land with proper form. As far as they still had to go, Izuku had certainly come a long way. You're going to have to be faster than that to defeat a villain like me, Tashinori grunted, kicking off the ground, and swinging forth with a humongous amount of force. If it connected, it would probably incapacitate Izuku, but he wasn't worried about that. Aside from the fact that he wasn't really aiming to hurt his student, Izuku was agile and smart. Tashinori had purposefully telegraphed his punch. That certainly didn't mean it wasn't terrifying for his ears to pop when Tashinori's fist sent hurricane-force winds past him. Trees parted on the edge of the clearing 100 meters away, dust rising in the cold air. Something in his heart twinged painfully, as he stumbled over his feet, leaping away from the still extended fist. This was a new occurrence. Up until now, Tashinori hadn't used one for all even once. If he thought this was difficult beforehand, this wouldn't even be a contest now that Tashinori wasn't pulling his punches. Izuku knew his mentor would never seriously injure him, but facing the man was a lot scarier now that he was using his quirk. Beforehand, he hadn't needed to worry about super strength and speed. Tashinori began to wind up for another punch, rushing at Izuku in the blink of an eye. Again, he rolled to the side. His heart raced, and his lungs burned, adrenaline pumping in his veins. At his current level, Izuku didn't stand a chance. His muscles would have to put out more force than they were physically capable of, and, as much as the adrenaline flowing through him helped, it wasn't enough. Tashinori flew towards him once more, and Izuku knew he couldn't react in time. In slow motion, the fist grew larger, as it made its way towards his face with probably lethal force. His teacher's face went slack, as he realized he was going to hit Izuku, but he was already in motion. Understandably, Tashinori was both relieved and confused when his fist hit nothing but air. Izuku gasped as his back hit the ground, and he lay there for a moment. Tashinori? Izuku said between breaths. I think I did it. I nearly hit you. That was too close for my liking. I think you did do it though, Tashinori said, hiding the panic in his voice. At that speed, you definitely would have been hit if you didn't. I must admit, I was anxious about trying that, but nothing else seemed to work. I don't think I can get up, Izuku said. His legs somehow felt like both lead and rubber at the same time. His head pounded, pain pulsing out from where it had slammed into the ground. That's enough for today, then. Do you remember how it felt to do that? Well, it's kind of like adrenaline. Adrenaline only pumps out when you need it to, and it feels like super strength for a moment. One for All feels kind of like that, but where adrenaline feels like a cold rush, One for All feels like my entire body is being warmed in a microwave. It's surprisingly gentle. Izuku smiled. He was sure he'd done it. Unfortunately, when he tried to stand up, he overdid it, and succeeded in nothing, but tossing himself a few feet into the air. My boy, Toshinori said, catching Izuku. It certainly appears you've activated One for All. 2 weeks later, Izuku found himself at the entrance to Yui for what could be his last time. Even an hour early, the place was packed, and he began to wish he'd come even earlier. Instead, he'd chosen to get a bit of extra sleep, but between the noise and Kaken's abuse of strangers, his nerves were killing him. Katsuki was in top form today. On a bad day, he would have been expelled before even getting into the school. Today, though, he was brooding. He shouldered his way past someone, and made his way up the stairs, glaring at extras, who wisely moved out of his way. Deku, don't fall behind me, he yelled, looking over his shoulder at the boy. Over the past few months, Deku had put on a lot of height, making him nearly as tall as Katsuki. From his position on the stairs, he could look down on his only friend. He never admitted it, but he took a sort of pleasure in being above him. Not that his superiority was in any question. Izuku quickened his pace, not wanting to give the boy any more excuses to embarrass him in public. The stairs disagreed with his plan, though, and tripped him up. He would have fallen on his face if not for a hand grabbing his backpack and pulling him to his feet. His face turned scarlet, and he turned rapidly to thank his savior. It would be bad luck to fall on your first day, don't you think? The girl said, flashing a bright smile. Even on the step below Izuku, she was tall enough to look him in the eyes. Yeah, thank you, Izuku stammered, looking to the side. He twirled his hair around his finger. Oh my god, I'm talking to a girl, what do I say? It's just my luck. I can't even talk to Kaken without stuttering. How am I supposed to talk to a girl? Are you alright? You're turning red. He let out a nervous laugh. I'm fine. I'm definitely fine. He's awkward, and thinks you're pretty. Come on, Deku, let's go. Katsuki grabbed him by the backpack, and pulled him away. I'm not gonna save your ass all the time. If you're lucky, she'll end up in our class, and then you can start flirting. That's not what Izuku tried to stammer out a defense, but couldn't get the words out. They walked silently to their seats in the hall, and spent the next hour analyzing the quirks in Izuku's 13th journal. So far, he'd only added a handful: Empty Lady, Kamiri Woods, and the beginnings of a fight he'd seen on the news while working out. When those analysis pages ran out, he turned to the next, and quickly slammed the journal shut. Katsuki wasn't one to be denied, though. He yanked the book from his friend, and turned back to the page his friend hadn't wanted him to see. What the fuck is this, Deku? Izuku hid his face in his hands. It's nothing, don't worry about it. Can I have my journal back? Not until you tell me what this shit is. Super strength? Enhanced speed? Possible effects on your quirk? Katsuki growled, whispering to his friend. Present Mike was on stage now, and he didn't want anyone overhearing. It's nothing, I swear. Just some notes I took while working with my tutor, Izuku said. This was bad. If Kaken figured out what was going on, he was going to blast him into the next life. Getting a quirk from the number 1 hero would probably be seen as some sort of cheating. Nobody was allowed to beat Kaken in anything. Are you on drugs? Is your tutor giving you steroids or something? What the fuck, Deku? Before he could respond, a student several rows ahead of them stood up. The two of them suddenly wished they had been paying attention, as the boy questioned Present Mike about misinformation on the pamphlet that had been handed out. Quickly, they pulled the pamphlets out of their pockets, and scanned them, pretending to have a clue what was going on. And you two, back there, quit whispering to each other. If you are here to socialize, you should leave immediately. How shameful of you to distract the rest of us before such an important exam, the severe teen said, mechanically chopping his arm up and down. Katsuki rolled his eyes. He'd humor the extras for now, but the second the exam started, all bets were off. He was going to murder the competition, and get an indisputable first place that would teach Mr. Glasses down there a lesson. It didn't take long before the speech was over, and they were on their way to separate exam sites. Izuku did his best to ignore his friend glaring at him as they walked away, fully aware that he was going to have to explain himself later. He took a deep breath to clear his mind. Kaken could wait. Getting on the bus was a new experience for Izuku. Up until now, he traveled around Yui on a cart with Toshinori. The one place he hadn't been to was the farthest reach of the school grounds, where the exam would take place. His mentor had been adamant that they avoid those to prevent an unfair advantage being given to Izuku, as if one for all wasn't too much of an advantage already. Much to his chagrin, the severe boy from earlier sat next to him. "You. I remember you from the entrance hall. You're the one who was muttering the whole time, are you not? Sorry about that. My friend and I had seats next to each other, and he took something of mine. That's understandable. My apologies for assuming the worst of you. My name is Tenya Ida," he said, extending his hand. Izuku took it, and did his best to smile. "Izuku Midoriya. I'm glad to meet you. Your name sounds familiar. You would probably be thinking of my older brother, the pro hero Ingenium. Your brother is Ingenium. That's so cool." They made small talk for the short duration of the ride, talking about pro heroes. Ida was much nicer than he had expected. It seemed he was simply earnest, and more anxious about the exam than he let on. Everyone seemed to be on edge, as they arrived at the site. "It's like a whole city. Do they have multiple of these here?" Izuku muttered under his breath, rapidly calculating the number of sites there would have to be, and came to the conclusion that there were 8 skyscraper-filled cities built just for the exams. His new acquaintance simply shook his head and began stretching. Deciding Ida had the right idea, Izuku began to run through the stretches he'd done daily for 10 months. One for all soreness began to fade, as he activated it, and worked his overcharged muscles into fighting form. In his head, he began to strategize. These robots couldn't be lethally powerful, but that didn't mean they wouldn't be easy to fight. In years past, the entrance exam had left multiple students rather severely injured. Without the on-grounds hospital, Yui would never have gotten permission to do such dangerous tests. But true danger brought out the best and worst in people. In any case, the exam would be rough, and Izuku would have to be careful to avoid getting injured. Speaking of injuries, he flicked his middle finger out, and flared his quirk at the same time. He hadn't quite gotten the hang of controlling his fire's temperature yet, but in a tight spot, he was sure he could use it to burn a hole through a robot. Even a fraction of a second of fire generation left his finger steaming in the air. If he wasn't careful, he could burn his hand to the bone. "Start!" President Mike shouted, standing somewhere between all 8 cities. Nobody could see, but he rolled his eyes as the students stood still. There's no countdowns to a disaster in the real world. If you want to be a hero, run! The ground cracked lightly as Izuku bounded past the gates, leaping over his fellow students' heads. Robots crawled around the cityscape, crowded the roads, and scaling the sides of buildings. One shattered against Izuku's steel-tipped boots, another broke to his fist. 2 points already, Izuku smiled, enjoying the gentle warmth of one for all. Tiny flames flickered in his wake, as he bounced off the side of a building, and grabbed a 2-pointer by its scorpion-like tail, using his momentum to throw it down the road, skidding, and slamming into several robots. Perhaps 45 seconds had passed, and he was doing well. His left leg spasmed painfully, as it complained about the overuse of his new powers. Keeping one for all at this level would only damage his body, an unacceptable prospect for the team. He couldn't crush robots if he couldn't move his legs. Resolving to be more careful, Izuku slowed down, dropping his output to 3/4 of what he'd been using. While he wasn't sure how strong he was compared to Toshinori, he estimated it was around 3%. If Toshinori could create Typhoon Force winds with a half-assed punch, he had to be way stronger than even high professional estimates. He'd have to think about that later. Now, more than ever, he was grateful for all the man had done for him. At 6 minutes into the examination, he should have been gasping for air. Being this active for this long wasn't something he thought he could do. The training sessions with All Might had paid off big time. Down the rubble-coated street, he could see Ida. From the way his shins were bruised, Izuku could tell his friend was doing well. As he watched, catching his breath, Ida performed a flawless roundhouse kick and disabled a 3-pointer. His friend rocketed off, disappearing past a flaming robot. A bright blue light struck another robot, the metal superheating and cracking as the robot slumped to the ground. Following the trail, Izuku could see a blonde-haired boy suggestively thrusting his hips towards another robot, looking distinctly uncomfortable. It was an odd mixture of actions and expressions, but the boy had a powerful enough quirk to be of note. By the way he was destroying robots, it seemed that he would pass the exam. Izuku took a deep breath and imitated the move he'd seen Ida use moments ago, sliding under a slow-moving projectile from the 3-pointer. This marked his 51st point, though he may have miscounted at some point. Over the communication speakers, he could hear President Mike shouting something. Vaguely, he heard 2, and assumed he must have 2 minutes left. He was both wrong and right. With 2 minutes remaining in the exam, President Mike counted down from 3, and pressed the huge, shiny red button, laughing, as he unleashed chaos upon the prospective students. This was where true grit would be tested, not in the face of tiny robotic villains, not in a burst of heroism, but in the final minutes of the exam, where true heroes would push past their exhaustion and help each other. Izuku was a little ashamed to admit he nearly pissed himself, as the building next to him shook, showering him with dulled pieces of glass. He could hear his fellow test-takers cry out, and dust rose from the other side of the building. Closing the distance by passing through an alley, he came face to face with a very crushed one-pointer. To his right, an absolutely colossal robot swung its arm into a building, which groaned and collapsed under its own weight. Much to his horror, he could see someone trapped just feet from the robot's treads. With no time for caution, Izuku rushed towards her. "Are you injured?" he shouted, reaching under the concrete. Rebar stuck deep into the asphalt, and Izuku's stomach dropped, as he realized there was no way to get the slab off her. Either he'd have to pull her out, or he'd have to wait until the exam was over to get help from a pro. "I think my ankle is broken, and I can't reach the concrete to use my quirk. Quick!" The girl was almost hysterical, shielding her face, as they were pelted by rubble. Popping sounds assaulted their ears, as concrete exploded under the force of the robot's treads. Helplessness threatened to overcome Izuku. If he could just be stronger, he could blow this thing away. It was less than 20 feet away, and closing fast. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head, one that he couldn't simply ignore. Not in the face of someone who needed help. "I'll save you, miss," he said, running away. "Come back," the girl cried, struggling to get free of the concrete. She took one last look at the boy, despairing, as her savior retreated. As she watched, though, he pivoted, and for a moment she thought she could see green fire floating in his wake. He smiled at her, crouched, and, holy shit, Tenya Ida considered himself a decent man. Tensei had told him so himself. His older brother was the smartest, strongest man he had ever met, and he admired him more than anyone. Ingenium could save anyone. He never ran from danger. So why was he running? Logically, he knew the massive robot was worth no points, and existed only to bother them. There had been no warning of the size of the robot. It had been on the same scale as the rest of them in their informational pamphlet. Yui has been surprisingly underhanded so far. This was the greatest hero institution in Japan. Surely there was a greater reason they introduced the robot. The teen turned, looking back at the robot. It reared back a fist, and Tenya's heart cried out, as he saw a person trapped under the rubble. She'd be killed instantly if that punch landed. His engines roared to life, as he began to run back, but someone was faster than he was. Before his eyes, the boy from earlier Midoriya appeared from nowhere. Something sparkled in the air, as the boy crouched, and Toshinori sat in the only room on campus that overlooked all 8 cities. Now that he thought about it, there were quite a few benefits of working with the prestigious academy. From here, he could see all the action, though his eyes were trained on one specific city. His successor was doing an amazing job. Proudly, Toshinori watched, as Izuku handled One for All. It was nowhere near as strong as what it would one day be, but he hadn't blown up his limbs. The training had worked. Unfortunately for him, there was a monkey wrench thrown into the situation. The massive zero-pointer had been thrown into the scene, and rubble had pinned a girl to the ground. "Izuku!" he cried out in horror, seeing his student run towards the injured girl. "Get her, and get out of there." But there was no way to move her, and he knew that in his heart. He'd seen this story happen before. He'd seen it 1,000 times. Someone he couldn't reach, someone who had bled out before he could get to them, someone who needed help when he'd reached his limit. Surely, they'd stop the exam before anyone was killed, but the robot did not stop, and he watched, as Izuku uncharacteristically charged away from the girl. He turned, and the remaining flames of One for All shouted in Toshinori. There was no way his boy would just leave an injured civilian like that. Even without hero training, the boy was much too heroic for that. From where Katsuki stood, he could see the robot rampaging on the other side of the city. Further away, he could see 6 others, and the last robot was hidden by the tall command tower centrally located between all 8 cities. The tallest building in Katsuki City was a great place to keep an eye on any remaining robots, and stay out of the way of the zero-pointer. Even so, it was definitely getting closer. He'd have to watch it. The other zero-pointers seemed to be having fun. Katsuki didn't remember anything of this scale from years before, and it concerned him. There was something terribly off about the situation, and he couldn't pin his finger on it. Maybe there was a reason for the increased difficulty? Something caught his eye in a city several sights away. A green comet blasted into the robot, sending it flying. Several seconds passed, and a shockwave rippled Katsuki's hair. "Not fair!" he shouted, blasting himself off the building in the direction of the biggest opponent he could see. There was absolutely no chance of anyone showing him up, damn it. He was Katsuki Bakugo, and he would be the best or there would be hell to pay. Izuku blasted off the ground with as much force as he could muster, leaving a scar of fused asphalt where he stood. His arms coated themselves in fire, and, as he soared through the air, the increased flow of oxygen flared them to a size he'd never been able to reach. Vaguely, he was aware of glass shattering as he flew down the street. In less than a second, he crossed more than 1,000 feet, slamming into the robot at maximum speed. A massive cloud of ash erupted out of the back of the robot's head, and a huge puncture wound appeared on it. Izuku's entire momentum had been transferred to the robot instantly, and it flew backward, lifted off its 100-ton treads, and collapsed. With a massive crash, it slammed into the ground, falling apart, and bringing buildings down on either side of it. Now that he was falling, Izuku felt nauseous. The pain was more intense than anything he had ever felt, and he'd burned all the skin off his arms more than once. Really, it had been dumb of him to put this off for so long, but he never tried to use both quirks at once. Of course, one for all would make his quirks stronger. Quirks were just like muscles. Delirious, Izuku wondered what Toshinori's quirk was. As the road rushed up to meet him, Izuku was glad he'd said something nice to his mother that morning. He'd hate for his last words to be something dumb, like "don't forget to buy banana bread." Had those been his last words? He couldn't remember. His leg was flapping in the wind, which definitely wasn't healthy. It was definitely broken, and the running outfit his mother bought him was ruined. If he survived this, she'd kill him. He smiled one last time. If he was going to die, he'd do it the way he'd want his hero to. Not that he wanted All Might to die. It was just that All Might did everything with a smile. Was Toshinori proud of what Izuku had done? Would Toshinori come to his funeral? Fate seemed to hate Izuku that day, because it slapped him in the face before he could hit the ground. Actually, it seemed like the girl he tried to save had slapped him. He deserved it. Running away from her when she needed help, what had he been thinking? The blood rushing in his ears rushed to his face, as he came back to a sane line of thinking. He was alive, he'd saved the girl, and he was now floating. He kept his eyes screwed shut, waiting for the ground to hit him so he could splatter. "Release," the girl said, breathing heavily. "Are you okay?" "I think my legs are broken," Izuku whispered, unable to find his voice. Those last few inches hurt. Achiko shut her eyes tight, as she reached out her hand to save the boy from a messy death. He'd just blown away a huge robot with a single punch. What kind of hero could do that? It reminded her of All Might's power, with the notable exception of the ash cloud. Fire had exploded out of the boy's hand when it touched the robot, releasing the brightest flash she'd seen all day. She was still seeing green when he began to fall. She opened her eyes. Seeing the boy before her, though, she regretted it. His legs were red and rubbery, and oh god, his arms were gone. Whoever this boy was, he certainly had a hell of a power. It was disturbing to look at. "Are you okay?" she asked hesitantly, turning her head away from him and wincing. "Stupid question. I think my legs are broken," he responded. A new voice appeared, this one much older than theirs. "Oh dear. I knew this was too much." Izuku still hadn't opened his eyes, he realized. This new voice sounded familiar. Every year, at the end of the televised entrance exam, he recalled seeing the youthful heroine, Recovery Girl. That must be who this was. "Recovery Girl," he shouted, opening his eyes to see her. "Stay down, young man. You're severely injured," the elderly woman said, beckoning two robots to prepare a stretcher. Seriously, what was Nisa thinking, pushing students this hard? This boy had lost both of his arms, and his legs were clearly shattered, and he was still trying to get up. "Severely?" Izuku muttered. He didn't feel a thing. It had hurt a lot earlier, but all the pain was gone now. He rolled over to the protests of the woman, and looked at his arms. That wasn't good. Both of his arms ended at the elbow, charred beyond belief. His stomach rebelled, and he turned his head to the side, groaning, as he released his breakfast. Yeah, that was definitely not good. All the pain returned at once, and tears formed in his eyes. "Miss Recovery Girl? I think I know what to do. You're going to do nothing, son, until we get you to the hospital. This is beyond the reach of my quirk alone. I'm afraid. No, ma'am, it's just that I've never tested my quirk like this. And I think I can put my arms back together. Recovery Girl paused. She'd seen her fair share of quirks that injured the user. Granted, it had been quite a while since she'd seen something that went this far. Back when Vlad King, who now oversaw Class 1B, had entered Yui, he'd damn near exsanguinated himself. When she'd gotten to him, he'd been white as a sheet of paper, and dried out like a piece of jerky. Let's see it then. Izuku focused, as best he could, through the pain. He could feel something out there, calling itself back to him. Even when he burned himself, as a kid, the flames had called to him. Instinctually, he pulled on the presence, drawing it towards him. The pain hit him instantly, and he screamed in agony, writhing on the ground, as the cloud of ash condensed above him, swirling like a tornado down towards him. Cementos was glad he'd been called to this site, as he threw up a protective barrier around the boy. Who the hell was this kid? He could barely hear himself think over the roar of the wind, and before he'd put up that barrier, the heat had been unbearable. The stumps of the boy's arms had begun to glow like embers when he'd pulled that cloud towards him. If he hadn't been here, Recovery Girl, and that young woman who had been trapped under the rubble would have been roasted. When the cloud had collapsed, and the screaming had stopped, Cementos pulled down the barrier, and all those present gasped. Well, that's impressive, he said, looking at the boy. His outfit had been charred, barely preserving his modesty, but he had arms again. Personally, Cementos would trade a teal-colored sweatshirt for functioning arms any day. Are you Recovery Girl began, but didn't bother finishing her sentence. It didn't appear the boy would be able to respond in any case. His eyes were closed, and his arms still glowed faintly, releasing a ton of heat. Air shimmered upwards, and the ground bubbled beneath him. Get him off the ground, she ordered, and the robots moved to pick him up. Before they could get any closer, Cementos stopped them with barriers, choosing instead to move the boy himself. Those flimsy metal robots would melt the second they touched him, and even for the hardened hero, he was hard to hold for too long. We need some water. Cool the boy off, the Recovery Girl barked at the nearby fire robots. Luckily, the robots were intelligent enough to not blast the poor boy with the full force of a fire hose. They aimed it upwards to sprinkle the boy with a shower of water, which flashed off of him instantly, creating a loud hissing sound. His arms, which had been ashen, solidified, and began to turn pink again. The Recovery Girl continued to shake her head. These students were going to be the death of her. They were only getting stronger, and she was only getting older. If she had any luck left in her, she'd pass away before the Quirk singularity destroyed society as a whole. Izuku was very grateful for unconsciousness. For once, he didn't want to be awake. Being awake was kind of a drag when your legs had been shattered like toothpicks in a firecracker, and your arms had been blown off, and then reattached with a blowtorch. Absolutely lovely. There was one problem. If he was unconscious, how was he conscious? That didn't sound right. Was he even conscious? What was this? He looked around, not that it did him any good. Wherever he was, it was pitch black. It was a weird state of things. He could see his body, but there was no discernible light source. He remembered a video of an astronaut from hundreds of years ago floating in space, but there were no stars. Whoa, he thought. Whoa, he said. That's weird, he thought / said, hearing the voice in his head come out of his mouth. Yeah, he was definitely unconscious / conscious. Subconscious, we'll call it. I guess this is my mind. If this was his mind, he thought it was kind of boring. Orderly and neat, but boring. He went back to the analogy of floating in space, and stars flickered into existence. Cool. Playing with being stuck in his mind was an interesting prospect. There were so many things he could do with a power like this. What uses did this have? He was sure there must be something, like physically replaying a fight. The stars blurred, as he rocketed unwillingly in the direction of one of them. A single star remained stationary, so he presumed that was where he was heading. If he wasn't so fascinated, he'd be concerned. Something massive flew by his head, and he flinched, as Jupiter receded into the distance. So I guess I'm going to Earth? He questioned. In answer, the cosmos laughed. That was unsettling. Wait, how do I slow down? Practicing her smile in the pond was one of her favorite pastimes. It let her ignore the other 7 people stuck here with her. Peace and quiet. Finally, her eyes trailed over her hair, matching her pitch-black uniform. Sometimes she wondered if she should dye it white to match her cape. Maybe golden, to match the accents. It wasn't meant to be. In the reflection, something green and screaming approached all too quickly, slamming into her favorite pond instants later. Nope. No thank you. Tashinori, get your ass over here. Her successor was going to fix the damage his successor had caused, or so help her, she was going to put another hole in his abdomen. Idiots love to do dumb things, and she hadn't been able to beat the habit out of him when she'd had the chance. 7 spirits felt a disturbance in One for All, as the 9th member joined them, and the 7th member was not happy about it. Izuku was terrified. Slamming into a planet at high speed was not his idea of a fun dream. Okay, maybe soaring through space was fun, and the impact hadn't hurt him, but this woman might. Why the hell did you have to land in this pond specifically? She screamed at the boy, who scrambled backwards, pond grass stuck in his hair. Maybe that was just how his hair looked when it was wet, actually. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, he said, doing his best to get away from the scary woman. She was soaked, and it was probably his fault. Definitely his fault, now that he thought about it. Seeing his mentor appear, though he was confused as to how, he appealed to the man for protection. Tashinori, she's gonna hurt me, the man sighed. Nana had always been one for pranks, but this one wasn't in the best of taste. Nana, he's just a kid. She couldn't take it anymore, and let out a cackle. Gah, Tashinori, I can't believe you chose such a wet blanket. He's just like you. Wet blanket? Just like him? Wait, chose? Izuku thought to himself, glad he could do so once more. If every thought he had was transmitted to these people, he'd be embarrassed for the rest of his life. Was he even alive? Well, welcome to One for All. I don't think you'll be here too long. It took Tashinori ages to develop the consciousness needed to be here. I'm in One for All? That's what I said. There should be 6 others, but they spent a lot of time in their own little worlds. It's a pleasant afterlife. Afterlife? Am I dead? Izuku whimpered. Nana, if that was her name, was scary. It seemed Tashinori's teacher hadn't been as kind as the man himself. No, you're not dead. This is just where your soul is connected to now. From what I understand, the human soul exists. I guess it normally travels to some afterlife, but the first user of One for All had a quirk which allowed him to pass his soul on. As the generations passed, the power grew. You've got the power of 8 souls before you. Izuku had absolutely no idea what that was supposed to mean. He'd never been religious, but he supposed that would change a bit. Was it even religion if he was experiencing it physically? There was no faith involved. Whatever the case, he had a lot of questions. His muttering was pretty impressive. The boy could speak faster than anyone Nana had met while she was alive. Is this normal? She asked, looking to Tashinori for advice. Yup, he sighed. To say Inko Midoriya used tissues was a bit of an understatement. When she arrived at the Yui hospital 2 days ago, they thought she had a water-based quirk, but it was just overactive tear ducts. Nobody blamed her. Getting the message that your only child had been injured was hard enough without Midoriya's trademarked emotional state. The number of wires hooked up to her son didn't help the situation. At this rate, the woman would be allowed to take her chair with her when she left. She'd spent 2 days straight there, too anxious to leave in case her baby woke up while she was gone. The recovery girl had told her not to worry. They were tracking his sleep, and they'd be able to detect when he was waking up. It was only then that she took a restroom break. When Izuku woke up a few hours later, he realized how much trouble he was in. His mother was a kind woman. It was very difficult to make her mad. That said, she was understandably pissed about him going completely overboard again. Recovery girl saved him from his mother by reminding them he still had to undergo a physical before checking out. Well, that's good. It seems you didn't suffer any head trauma this time. Musudafu Children's Hospital sent me your records. When you fixed your arms, the heat was fairly intense. I was worried you might get a dangerously high fever, but I think your body is capable of handling overheating. Inko hadn't realized anything was wrong with his arms. They didn't look bad. What happened to his arms? If it's his quirk, I understand. He's been burning himself for a long time. You may want to take a seat for this one. The mother's heart crawled into her throat. That was never a good thing to hear. Her baby boy was far from stupid, but that didn't mean he didn't do dumb things. It seemed he took after his father in that regard. When we found him, he'd burned both of his arms off. I believe his quirk evolved to the point where he's able to create ash out of his body, and he can manipulate that. From what I've seen, it's not comfortable, and requires extremely high heat. That's conjecture. My point is that when he took down that huge robot, he created a huge ash cloud, and later pulled most of it back to him to reform his arms. Izuku really wished she hadn't told his mom about that. She was never going to let him out of her sight again, at this rate. Recovery girl's guess wasn't too far from the truth. During his dream he talked to Nana Shimura, and come to the understanding that One for All had combined her quirk with his. Disintegration was a powerful quirk. She was able to dissolve herself, and reconstitute with ease. It made her a terrifying opponent, and was extremely useful for scaring the hell out of a weaker villain. Unfortunately for the boy, they had no idea how he was supposed to control it, and it seemed to injure him more than it should. The recovery girl took a moment to let the boy's mother absorb that. "Well, if he reformed his arms, that's fine, right?" she said hesitantly. "We're not entirely sure. Due to the extent of the damage, it's possible that he has minor nerve damage. He's been healing for 2 days, and the progress of his nerves has slowed. It took quite a bit for Inko not to faint. Her son had nerve damage." "No, that couldn't be right. Can it be fixed?" "Well, there's always the possibility that he could direct his quirk to recreate the nerves. I spent some time writing up a preliminary report on his quirk which I've sent to your address. I think it should arrive at around the same time as you get home. If you leave soon, which you should, I have a lot of work to do." Recovery girl not so subtly hinted at her goal. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.